All right, you guys, we are in Hebrews chapter 2. If you guys want to move over there, we're going to start in verse 17 just to kind of refresh ourselves. We have been talking about how Jesus is man, and the author has been emphasizing that and talking about how Jesus is one of us. Before that, he was talking about how Jesus is God. So he's been tackling both of these sides and talking about how Jesus has all of this power and authority, and then switching it up to showing how Jesus is also a man, and he's gonna put in this new concept about Jesus being the high priest, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But he's going to bring this up throughout the book several times, and I think one of the cool aspects of this is we don't have all of this context of what a high priest is because we don't, there's no temple that we go to. There's no high priest. We don't even have the regular priests. I don't know what you call them. Do you just call them priests or low priests? I don't know. They're not the high priests, but
Medium
we don't
priest.
have those. The medium priests. Okay. So we don't have those. So we don't get a lot of this context. There's actually a lot of Mosaic law that includes the high priest in different aspects here and there. And as he brings them up, we're going to hopefully look at some of the context. So this week, that's what a lot of what we're going to do is we're going to look at the context of what it means, what he's trying to say here. But we're going to read verse 17 and 18 first and see what it is he does say, and then take a look at what this means by looking at some passages in the Old Testament. So let's see, Charlie, would you mind reading verses 17 and 18? So Hebrews chapter 2,
Sure,
17 and 18.
sure. Therefore, in all things, he had made to like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted.
All right, so he says something really interesting in 17. He says, therefore, in all things, he had to be made like his brethren. And then it says that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the things pertaining to God. So there's this interesting thing that he's pointing out that Jesus couldn't be the high priest as God. He needs to be the high priest as man. He has to be a man in order to be the high priest, which is really interesting. And again, this is this focus on the point that Jesus is man. And again, just to clarify, so it doesn't sound like I'm being heretical when I make some statements like this, we are not saying that Jesus is just a man. He is fully man and he is fully God. In chapter 1, we looked about how he is God, and now we are looking at how he is man. But the author here is saying how Jesus had to become one of these men in order to become our high priest. And then it says something interesting. He, our faithful and high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. So again, I just want to point out Jesus had to become a man to become a high priest. And there is at least one thing that would come to mind, and that is the high priest had to come from a specific family. Now, at this time, they're following the Mosaic law, and according to the Mosaic law, the high priest had to be a Levite. He had to come from the family and the tribe of Levi. So again, this would disqualify anybody who's not from the tribe of Levi to become high priest. Interestingly, Jesus is not from the tribe of Levi. And this is really interesting because as you read the Old Testament, there's prophecy that tells us he's going to come from the tribe of Judah. He's going to come from David's family. And so he comes from this family, but he's not in the tribe of Levi. And that's okay. The author's going to explain this a little bit further on, how there's actually another priestly order that was before the tribe of Levi, and that is the priestly order that Jesus comes from. But still, he does have to be a man in order to come from this, to be part of this priestly order, which is interesting. And there's a reason why he has to become a man, because notice what he says: to make propitiation for the sins of the people.
Mhm.
And this is key to understanding why he has to be a man. His job as high priest is to reconcile man to God. So God doesn't reconcile man to himself. He sends someone as a man, or he sends himself as a man to reconcile man with God. So we have a man who's doing this reconciliation part. And so we're going to take a look at this whole uh propitiation for the sins of the people. And I just want to bring it up. This is when they're talking about this culturally, there would be an understanding that he's talking about the Day of Atonement. This is this time of the year, this one time of the year where the high priest performs these ceremonies, and the Day of Atonement is this reconciliation between man and God, and it happens on this particular day of the year. So we're going to take a look at that, and that is in Leviticus chapter 16. So if you want to move over to Leviticus 16, we'll look at that. And we're not going to go through the whole chapter. There's a lot in there. We're not going to look at the entire ceremony and all of the things that happens. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on the high priest aspect of this and look at what the high priest does. And specifically, here's the cool part that we're going to see is that there's a picture of Jesus in this picture, in this work that the high priest has to do. Because what we're going to see is that Jesus actually is a fulfillment of a whole bunch of these pictures that God is bringing up, and it's pretty cool. Let's see, we got a long stretch here. Why don't we do Tim, could you read verses 1 through 9? And then John, could you read verses 10 through 22?
And now the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron when they offered profane fire before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at just any time into the holy place inside the veil, before the mercy seat which is on the ark, lest he die. For I will appear in the cloud above the mercy seat. Thus Aaron shall come into the holy place with the blood of a young bull as a sin offering and of a ram as a burnt offering. He shall put the holy linen tunic in and the linen trousers on his body. He shall be girded with a linen sash, and with a linen turban he shall be attired. These are holy garments. Therefore he shall wash his body in water and put them on. And he shall take from the congregation of the children of Israel two kids of the goats as a sin offering, and one ram as a burnt offering. As Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall take the two goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of the meeting. Then Aaron shall cast lots for the two goats, one lot for the Lord, and the other lot for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat in which the Lord's lot fell and offer it as a sin offering.
But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord, to make an atonement with him, and to let him go for a scapegoat into the wilderness. And Aaron shall bring the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and shall make an atonement for himself and for his house, and shall kill the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself. And shall take the censer full of burning coals of fire from off the altar before the Lord, and his hands full of sweet incense beaten small, and bring it within the veil. And he shall put the incense upon the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat that is upon the testimony, that he die not. And he shall take of the blood of the bullock, and sprinkle it with his finger upon the mercy seat eastward, and before the mercy seat shall he sprinkle of the blood with his finger 7 times. Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering, that is for the people, and bring his blood within the veil, and do that with the blood as he did with the blood of the bullock, and sprinkle it upon the mercy seat and before the mercy seat. And he shall place an atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanliness of the children of Israel, and because of their transgressions and all their sins. And so shall he do for the tabernacle of the congregation, that remaineth among them in the midst of their uncleanliness. And there shall be no man in the tabernacle of the congregation when he goeth in to make an atonement in the holy place, until he come out, and have made an atonement for himself, and for his household, and for all the congregation of Israel. And he shall go out unto the altar that is before the Lord, and make an atonement for it, and shall take of the blood of the bullock, and of the blood of the goat, and put it upon the horns of the altar round about. And he shall sprinkle of the blood upon it with his finger 7 times, and cleanse it, and hallow it from the uncleanliness of the children of Israel. And when he hath made the end of the reconciling of the holy place, and the tabernacle of the congregation, and the altar, he shall bring the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat, and confess over him all the iniquities of the children of Israel, and all their transgressions and all their sins, putting them upon the head of the goat, and shall send him away by the hand of a fit man into the wilderness. And the goat shall bear upon him all their iniquities unto the land not inhabited, and he shall let it go the goat until the wilderness.
There's so many pictures in here. Even now, as I studied it, I'm seeing even more. It's like every time I read this, there's just so many interesting things. I just have a real quick question, Tim. You in verse what was it? Verse 5. It says, did you say lamb or ram? Is there a ram as an offering, burnt offering, or a lamb as a burnt offering?
A ram.
A ram. Okay, I heard lamb and I was like, wait a second, I didn't catch that before, so I wanted to make sure. Okay, it is ram.
It is.
All right, so before we get into this, I just want to point out something really quickly in verses 1 and 2, or actually, I guess it's just verse 1, that this Day of Atonement. God is bringing to Moses that's the ceremony that they need to do. But notice that it's done after the death of Aaron's 2 sons, and they brought profane fire. We don't know all the exact details of this fire, but one of the things we do know is that to some extent they were just making their own way. They weren't doing what it was that God had prescribed. Instead of doing what God had prescribed, they had come up with their own smoke, which I don't know what this is. We don't know what that is, but they didn't do it the way God asked them to do it. And there's an important point here, which is we don't have access to God just because we want access to God. We don't get to come to God in any old way that we want. We have to go through a specific way to do it. We have to do it in the way that God prescribed, right? We don't get to just come to him. And this is important for us because this is something people aren't going to like, but the way that we get to God is through Jesus. And that's the only way we get to God, right?
Mhm.
There's only one way to be reconciled with God, and that is through Jesus. Any other way would be similar to this profane smoke idea. You're making up your own way, you're making up your own ceremony, and God's not up for that, and he's not into it, and he doesn't accept it. It doesn't work. So there's this first aspect that we have to understand, and this does go along with Hebrews. We're told that Jesus is our high priest to bring propitiation between us and between the people and God. And so I just want to bring that up. That he's the only way that we have reconciliation. He's the only way through which propitiation occurs. There's no other method of this happening. So I just want to bring this up. This is interesting, but we want to keep that in mind. So we're going to talk about some of these things. We're not going to go into a lot of the details unless somebody ends up jumping us over there, but we're not, I don't have any plans for going into a lot of the details. I do want to talk a little bit about the sin offering, because the way that's prescribed, but that's prescribed again in Leviticus chapter 1. And again, that was a fun journey just studying through, but just a touch. I just want to just touch on it a tad. But before we do that, let's look at the Day of Atonement. And I don't know if you caught this, but just in case you didn't catch this, on the Day of Atonement with the high priest, there are 3 sacrifices. And I didn't even notice one of them until I started really looking at this last week. But there is a bull sacrifice, there is a ram sacrifice, and there is a goat sacrifice. And so I just want to bring that up. There's this 3 of them that are happening, but they have there's different reasons for them. So we want to look at them and look at how, again, when we're talking about, the author's talking about propitiation of the people, I think he's talking about more specifically the sacrifice of the goat. But before we do that, let's just walk through it. So there's three sacrifices that has to happen. The first one is there is a bull sacrifice, and that is done for the high priest as a sin offering for the high priest. Then there is a ram sacrifice, which is also called a burnt sacrifice. And I should point out, the bull sacrifice is also a burnt sacrifice, I believe. I believe I read that right. But a burnt sacrifice, so whenever there's a sacrifice, there's often what they would do is they would kill the animal, and part of it would be offered to the Lord. And then the person who did the sacrifice, they might get a part of it, or the priest might get a part of it. And for some of that, there's this picture of having communion or having a meal with the Lord. You know, you're having a barbecue, God gets some of it and you get some of it. And there's this idea of community between man and God. But here, just so it's clear, that's not happening to that degree. We're having a burnt sacrifice, which means the entire animal is consumed in the fire to the Lord. So we have a bull sacrifice as a sin offering for the high priest. That is, before he can do the Day of Atonement,
Right.
he has to have atonement for himself for his own sin. Then there's this burnt offering of the lamb, which is just completely consumed. And then there's this offering of the kid as a sin offering, but for the people. And then there's this other kid that's dealt with as well. So that's the interesting aspect, or that's the flow of this particular ceremony. We have three sacrifices, and then this sending away of the fourth animal, which is the kid. So let's start with the first one. The high priest has to give a sin offering for himself. And I find this really interesting because the author of Hebrews is really pointing out that Jesus is man and Jesus is the high priest. And in this ceremony, the high priest has to give a sacrifice for himself. And so it is a sin sacrifice. It is to atone for his sins. And this is interesting because when we think of Jesus, we think of him as not sinning. And I'm not saying that that's false. He's without sin, right? So why in the world does he have to give a sin offering for himself? Now, the high priest at this time, before Jesus, he is a man. He does have sin. He does have to do a sin sacrifice for himself. But do you think Jesus has to atone for himself? According to this picture, it looks like he does. And I think the reason is because I think it's because he takes our sin upon himself. And so and notice that this is an individual's atonement. This is an atonement of one specific person, the high priest. And I think this is what this picture is it's Jesus taking our sin on himself, and then he's going to God and reconciling himself with God with our sin. And so we have this really interesting picture of the high priest atoning for himself. And I think that Jesus even fits in this picture because he's without sin, but he does take our sin. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think I'm way off on this picture here?
No, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that he had to do it to put our sin on him. That's 100% where I was thinking.
And I want to point out again, this is a sin offering for an individual. This is different than what we're going to get to when we get to the kid offering, which is a offering for a community. And so that's also interesting, and that's different. But we see the first offering is the sin offering of the individual, which we have as Jesus. He was our high priest. He makes atonement for his sin, but it's not his sin. It's our sin that he took. So there's this beautiful picture that we see of Jesus doing this. And again, this is to bring reconciliation. This allows man to come into the presence of God, to be with God to have communion with God. Without this, we are in rebellion against God, and we can't be reconciled. We can't be together. We don't have a relationship in that sense. But here, because of this, because of the high priest reconciling us, and I say high priest, I mean Jesus, because of Jesus reconciling our sin, paying for our sin, we get to have that access to God as an individual. There's this other aspect that we see of the burnt offering, whereas the ram is a burnt offering. That means the ram is killed and he's put on the fire, and then he's completely burned. He's completely consumed. And I think that this is also a picture of Jesus, because what we see in the offering that Jesus supplies for us, he's completely consumed, right? He goes all the way to death, and he goes past that, right? He's not like he's almost dead and he's like, okay, that was good enough. He's like, nope, I'm going to death. And then he didn't even stop there. He's going to stay dead for 3 days, right? So there's this picture of complete consumption of Jesus when he sacrifices himself, when he goes on the cross and he dies for our sins. He's dead for 3 days. And so there's this picture of being consumed. He's in hell. And we know that some of this pictures of hell is like, there's this picture of fire. There's also some other stuff. But we see that he's in there for 3 days. And it's just really interesting that it's just a total, complete being consumed. And what I think is really interesting is we also see there's a prophecy in Psalms 22 that although the Messiah was going to die, he would not see corruption, which is really interesting. So he's completely consumed, but he's not corrupted. And that's this picture of him coming back to life. I got to take a drink of water. You guys, what do you think about this? Are you excited? I think this is cool. So maybe I'm just the only one who likes Leviticus. That's okay.
It appears the old way is just an awful lot of work.
Yeah, it requires 4 animals, and these aren't cheap animals, right? The bull is not a cheap animal. And I'll touch on that at the end a little bit. But we have a bull, we have a lamb, we have a kid, and we have another kid. Right. So and not only that is a lot of work, there's a lot of death. There's 3 animals that are killed. And for each of these offerings, the way you do it is you put your hands on the animal and you slit its throat and you feel the animal die. And so this is a crazy thing. We also see on the Day of Atonement, traditionally, the people from Israel would all gather to Jerusalem and have sin offerings. There was a lot of animals dying. There was a lot of blood everywhere during this particular festival because there was so much sin offerings happening. Plus, there was going to be this. I have heard, and I don't recall the details, but I have heard about how they would have all the priests working all the time trying to get through all the offerings to get all these sin offerings done on this particular day. It was a lot of work for the priests, both physically and emotionally. I'm assuming at some point they get hardened to the death that's going on, but the goal was for the people to not be that way, right? That's why the people had to put their hands on the animal and feel it die. And so it was that was pretty incredible.
Hey, John, how is it different or similar? Is Yom Kippur, is that the same thing as the Day of Atonement, or are we talking about 2 different things, or is it like a watered down version?
That's a good question. Today? I don't know that I know the answer to that. I know that Yom Kippur includes the Day of Atonement, but I think Yom Kippur is a little bit longer of a celebration. Does anybody else know the answer? I'm not 100% sure. And I should point out that today's traditional how they celebrate some of these festivals is different than how they celebrated it in the Old Testament, because they have no temple. They have no ability to perform these sacrifices. So they've changed some of how they celebrate it to reflect that. So it's going to be a little different than it was back then. John, were you going to say something?
I thought it was like a Jewish New Year type thing, but I don't know.
Yes, there's a lot of all of things that come with the Day of Atonement, and it is kind of like a new year. And then every 50 years, there's this year of Jubilee, which is like it's all supposed to be new. When they had slaves, they had to free the slaves. There was a whole bunch of interesting things that happened. So it's quite the celebration.
It's interesting to me that for one, the high priest, it requires a bull. And for all the rest of the congregation, it requires a goat.
Yeah.
Put
So
me in a big, huge bull. I don't know if it's to scare her, but I'm thinking, you know, a big, huge bull. And then for the congregation, it's one little goat, man. It just seems interesting. It seems like it should be the other way around.
So this is an interesting fact. I was going to bring it up at the end, but I'll just bring it up a little bit of it now, which is really interesting. If you read Leviticus chapter 1, God talks about the sin offering and how the sin offering needs to be performed. There's 3 versions, 4-ish versions of the sin offering. One, if there was a sin offering that needed to be done for the high priest, he needed to use a bull. The high priest's sin offering, personal sin offering, had to be a bull. In conjunction with that, if the priest was doing a sin offering for the entire congregation, it also needed to be a bull. So if the people as a group did some sin and he needed to do an offering for that, it also was a bull. So the bull offering was both for the high priest and for the congregation, which is interesting because it's not for the Day of Atonement. That's a different sin offering. So I find that interesting. The second type of offering was a sin offering for a ruler or a king. And for a ruler or a king, they had to use a goat. So the sin offering for a ruler or a king was a goat. So for a priest, it's a bull. For the people, it's a bull. For a goat, I'm sorry, for a king, it's a goat. Then, if you needed to do a sin offering for just the regular old people, and I forgot what the word was, like ordinary person or something like that. If you need to do a sin offering for a regular person, then you have 2 options. If you can afford it, you would do a lamb. And if you couldn't afford it, you would do either a turtle dove or a pigeon. So we have these 3 ways of sin offering. We have a sin offering for the high priest, and I'm lumping that in with the congregation, and we have the sin offering for the ruler, and we have the sin offering for the regular person, and the regular person was a lamb. And I think the reason for that was it was recognition that people can't not everybody could afford a bull, right? So they would go with what was cheap. And if they couldn't even afford a lamb, God made provision for a turtle dove or a pigeon so that even the poor could have access to God, that even they could have their sin offering taken care of. And the rulers had to do a goat, which was a little bit more expensive than the regular people, than the lamb. But the high priest, it had to do a bull, which in my opinion, that's really interesting, that the sin of a high priest is much more costly than the sin of a regular person. And I just find that really interesting, the way God had set that all up. But it is a good observation, Dad. It is interesting. You would think God didn't do it the way that we would expect it, because he recognizes that he made a way for us. He did it so that there was a way we can do it. And even none of this really worked, right? None of this was a real good way to be reconciled with God. It doesn't happen until the high priest changes and we have Jesus as our high priest and as the sacrifice, that we have the proper reconciliation with God.
But I do see why a little bit why the high priest would require a big bull, because the high priest shouldn't be sinning. They should be the holy, right? Oh God, what's the R word? I can't even think of the R word. But yeah, he shouldn't be sinning. Sorry. Oh, it's gonna pop up. Right.
No, I mean that's right. And so that's interesting. That's God didn't do it based on necessarily rank. He did it based on where you should be, right? Spiritually, the high priest should not be sinning. And then second to that, the king should be getting his direction from the high priest and be spiritually more mature than the regular Joe Schmo as well. It's interesting.
I just think we
All
lose.
right.
Sorry,
Oh, go
I was
ahead.
trying to comment real quick that it's just interesting. And I think, we're certainly obviously thankful for Jesus, but in the Old Testament, you kind of lose some aspect of that sacrificial portion that makes the seriousness of approaching
Yeah.
God. It gets lost, right, in church. But that's where I think, the preaching of the cross should always bring us back to that. But we humans have this tendency of, whether it's for relative terms, harder to approach God versus easier to approach God. We can always mess it up one way or the other, right? I mean, from the harder side, they make it into a ritualistic thing that even the sacrifices become meaningless. On the easier side, in the sense that we have today, we don't have to make sacrifices, then you lose sense of the awe or the presence of God, or the approach that was bought for us, that we might have access by faith. It says, into this grace in which we stand. And it's and that's where the worship portion has to come in. But the heart of men can be so finicky. On one end, you would think, oh man, if we went to the Old Testament, there would be such an awe of God. There would be, probably for a while. We saw it with David, we saw it with Solomon, we saw it with Moses, but then it drops off, into this whole crazy thing. In the Old Testament, we saw what that, and then God rebukes their sacrifices in Isaiah and Malachi, right? I don't want any of it, because you guys aren't doing it with your heart. So anyhow, I just thought that contrast sometimes, I don't know, there's a happy medium. I don't want the happy, I don't want to be slaughtering goats every Sunday. It's just, there is an appropriateness, I don't know what the word for it, but a reverence, if you will, for what's happening on a Sunday basis when we remember Jesus, that sometimes gets lost because we're no longer sacrificing, laying our hands on goats and bulls and stuff like that. So
and just to kind of piggyback off of what you're saying, we're losing the seriousness of sin, right? The consequences of sin. It's a good point, and we need to and this is why I like how this whole chapter starts with God saying, hey, because don't get confused about Aaron's sons and their profane smoke. You don't get to just do that. You have to come to God, and he's the one who's going to do the reconciliation, and you have to do it his way, or there's no reconciliation. Yeah. I like that, Rich. That's good. All right, so let's get to this last sacrifice, and that is the sacrificing of the kid. So there are two kids. There is one where the kid is sacrificed, and this is for the sin of the people. And this is why I wanted to bring this up. When in Hebrews, when he talks about propitiation for all the people, I don't think he's talking about the bull sacrifice. I don't think he's talking about the ram sacrifice. That bull sacrifice is for the individual sin of the high priest. But the kid sacrifice is for the sin of the congregation. It is for the sin of the people. And so there's this aspect of this Day of Atonement, that there's this one part where this is for the people, but it doesn't take one kid, it takes two kids. And this is really interesting, because one of them is sacrificed for the sin of the people, but then the other one, they lay hands on it. And this is interesting. They speak the sin of the people upon it. And there's this idea that they're transferring not the sin on the goat, but the memory, the vocalness, what has happened of their sin. They put it on the goat. The sin that they placed on the first goat, their sin was transferred to that goat, and it was killed. It was dead. But the second goat, they speak over it. And then that goat is sent out into the wilderness. And it is interesting. I was just reading when we were going through there, it has to be a suitable man who's going to take that sin out into the wilderness. And what they do is they take that goat way out, way out. This is their job, right? They take it seriously. And even this is where we get our term scapegoat from. It comes from this passage. They take it way out in the wilderness and they let it go. It's still alive. It's still out there, but it's supposed to have no chance of coming back to the people. It's out there. It's gone. And this picture is that God is taking the memory of our sin. He's putting it on this goat. and he's sending it way out so it's never brought back. He's never going to remember our sins again. And this is this cool aspect of what God does with us, that he takes our sin, the sin is paid for, and then on top of that, he's like, it's paid for. I'm not bringing it up anymore. We're not going to talk about it. It's, if somebody comes and accuses you and says, well, they did that, he's going to be like, I don't want to hear it. It's already been forgiven. It's already taken care of. That sin is way out in the wilderness and it's gone. And then I like that picture. It has to be taken out there by a suitable man. And again, this is a picture of Jesus, the suitable man, the only one able to take, not only to redeem us and our sin, but to take the memory of that and take it far away from God so that he's not even going to bring it up. And I bring this up because we talk about how God doesn't remember our sin. Sometimes we may use that wording. And it's not that God doesn't remember our sin, because that kind of sounds like, well, he kind of forgot, and maybe somebody will bring it up and he'll remember it. It's not like that at all. He's like, the memory of your sin, I sent it away. It's gone. And I'm refusing to remember that sin. It's different than forgetting it. He's refusing to bring it up anymore. He's like, it's done. It's paid for. And so there's this great picture here again of Jesus as our high priest. He's the only one who can do this, that can both pay for our sin in that first sacrifice where he does this redemption, reconciliation between man by taking our sin on himself and then redeeming it. Then we have the picture of the burnt offering of the ram, where the ram is just totally consumed. And then we have this picture of the kid who is sacrificed as a sin offering of the people. So the people's sin is put on this goat. And then fourthly, the memory of that sin is put on a second goat who is sent off into the wilderness, never to return back. And so we just have this great picture of Jesus who is doing that much better than these other high priests who are human and not able to do this as well. And the sacrifices of these animals, which, it is as God prescribed, but it's all temporary. Again, they have to do this all the time, at least once a year for the Day of Atonement, and then they're supposed to be doing the sin offerings more than that. So there's just, it wasn't as good, but Jesus is the better sacrifice because it only needed to be done once. Oh, I gotta look through my notes real quick. All right. So before we get back to Hebrews, I just want to bring up one more point, which my dad mentioned as an observation, that the sin offering for the people was a goat. And I'm just bringing this up because the sin offering, again, there was three types of sin offering. There was one for the high priest, there was one for royalty, and there was one for the people. And the high priest was a bull, the royalty was a kid or a goat, and the regular people was a lamb or some birds. But it's interesting to me that the sin offering that takes place here is a kid. Why do you think that he uses the royal sin offering for the sin offering of the people instead of either the bull or the lamb?
Because Jesus is the King of Kings and we are part of his family. So that makes it
okay.
royalty.
That makes us royalty.
Yeah.
I like it. I mean, that's absolutely true, right? We are told in Hebrews, as we were going through this, we were talking about how we get an inheritance and how we're part of his family. And there's all of this aspect. And as we get through Hebrews, we're going to keep seeing that we are going to rule. Actually, we saw that a lot in chapter 1, right? We're going to rule. We're going to be rulers with him at some point when he comes back. And so I just find this interesting that during this time, he's using the royal sin offering for the people instead of the ordinary sin offering for the people. And I think that what I think is being pointed out is there was a sin offering for ordinary people. That was a lamb or that was a turtle doves, and that was for us so that God was accessible for everybody. Everybody had the ability to go get a sin offering and have access to God. But that's not how God sees us. He sees us as rulers and royalty. We're not ordinary people. And we got to all remember that. We're not ordinary people. And God has a plan specifically for each of us. And part of that plan for each of us is ruling. We're going to be rulers. So, and I'm just gonna. This is just something that I'm gonna pull up here. Is when we look at the parable of the talents. For some, he gives a lot and they receive a lot in return, and for some he gives a little and they receive a little, and it's all according to their ability. And I'm just bringing this up. We're all going to rule, and we're all going to rule according to our ability. Right now, you probably have the ability to maybe increase that ability if you want. You have the ability to become a more mature person, to try to become more like him. I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm losing my train of thought, but it's okay. I just think it's cool. We're all going to be rulers according to our ability. I'm working on having a high ability. I'm going to be a big ruler. I don't know if that's true. I might just be physically big. I don't know. But
I'm not going to care.
it's going to be awesome,
there.
right? We get to be in the presence of God, and he gives us a job. I'm up for it. I'll do it.
I'm pretty sure I'm
Absolutely.
broom sweeper.
I think we have to care though in some degree. It's not, we don't care in the sense that every single person, whether they barely make it or they make it by the grace of God in a an amazing way, perseverance or suffering or whatnot. And at least to me, that's the other end of making it to heaven, right? He who endures till the end. And there's some that have kind of gone through life in a different way, but where Paul says, yeah, I mean, everything will be burned. You're barely making it by the skin of your, but I mean, we're going to be thankful, but at the same time, I think we have to be careful about not saying we don't care about what's coming, because the exhortation biblically is to pursue the eternal things and to lay up for yourselves treasures to heaven. So it's like, we could also not care about our financial conditions here on the earth in some sense, but there's a wisdom and a prudence to how we structure our lives and our spending so that we set up for something much better. And they're kind of they're not the same thing, and I'm not saying, Dan, you're wrong. I'm just saying that, because I didn't think
It's a good point.
we're all on the same page. It's just the language we have to use when we tell people we have to, inspire, exhort, and push people to think on longer terms where things last for eternity and those rewards are going to matter in some degree. Now, then you get Revelation where we cast our crowns before him. So I don't know, so it's kind of so it's kind of this weird thing, but it seems to exhort both, and we have to be aware of that. That's all.
I didn't care. I meant that when I get to heaven, I'm going to be so overwhelmed. It's going to be. I'm just going to walk around with my mouth open. I can't even begin to imagine a God who can hold the whole universe in the palm of his hand and yet has a personal relationship with me. I mean, when I get there, I'm sure it's kind of like taking a kid out of the ghetto and asking him if he wants an ice cream or an ocean cruise. He knows what an ice cream is. He's not really sure what an ocean cruise is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just rambling on.
I think what you're saying is heaven is enough. Being in the presence of God is enough. And that's absolutely true, right? That's enough, but that wasn't his plan. He doesn't give us with just what we need or just what we want. He's like, there's going to be more. You're going to have the presence of God and you're going to rule. And Rich, that it's a great point, because we don't want to neglect our salvation. We need to have a perspective of eternity and a perspective of the prize. There's a prize. There's a prize associated with this, and Jesus is the prize, but that's not it. There's more, and that's his plan. It's a wonderful plan. I love the plan. I wouldn't have planned it that way, but that's his plan. So let's do it. I'm all for it. It's great.
I know I have a tendency in regards to this discussion of unfortunately thinking more of works. I start to focus on those works, and that's what we're talking about here. And for me personally, I know if I start thinking about that, where I'm going to be in heaven, and my rewards, my sinful nature will tend to start to look at, well, can I do more works? Can I do more things? And you know, that's the devil just chirping in my ear. Hey, you know, you got to do some more stuff here, Tim.
You know what, Tim? That is a perfect segue into our next verse. So we have like 5 minutes. So why don't we jump back to Hebrews? We're going to do Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18. And at least I see this as a perfect segue. So maybe not everybody will, but I'm just going to read it. So this is Hebrews chapter 2, verses 18. So verse 17, he talks about the propitiation for the sin of the people. And then verse 18, for in that he himself has suffered being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. And I'm just bringing this up because what we see, this actually ties back with the earlier part of the passage, with Jesus being a fully man. He came as man. He had to be as man. And it says, and he put his trust in him. And then we have at the end, and he put his trust in him, but he was tempted. And I think when I was thinking about this, and maybe I'm wrong, and you guys are welcome to correct me, but I think that when we get down to temptation, really what it comes down to is, are we going to do it my way, or are we going to do it somebody else's way? That's the temptation. Is somebody else says I need to do it their way, and I'm like, but my way's better. And I think to bring it back to what Tim said, I think this is where the temptation is, where we're like, well, if God's asking me to mow the lawn once, then I'm going to mow that lawn twice because it's twice as good. And because I'm going to do it my way, kind of combined with what God had said. But that's the kind of the temptation, right? We want to, if God says, I want you to take one step, then we're like, I'm going to take 10 steps because I want to be super doing what God's telling me to do. And that's the temptation, is we're still taking what he tells us to do and then kind of doing it our own way. And I think this is kind of cool, because we can be reminded that even Jesus, there was a lot of times where even his disciples were like, you know, with Lazarus, hey, why don't we go there now? And he's like, no, that's not what God wants me to do. That might be my way, that might be your way, but that's not God the Father's way. We're going to stay here. And there's this, we see that he was tempted, and he teaches us to follow in his footsteps, which is we don't do it our way, we do it his way. And the cool thing is there's rewards in that. When God says take one step and you only take one step, there's a reward in that, right? And then because the next time he might actually say, okay, I can trust you a little bit more. I'm going to tell you to take 2 steps now. And we see this cool thing. I'm convinced that not only does God want us to know his will, but he is willing to tell us his will for our lives much further in the future than what we think. There have been times in my life where God has told me things where I'm like, really? And then it doesn't happen for years. And I think he's good with that, if he knows he can trust us with that and that we'll follow him. But at the same time, there's a lot of times, and there's a lot of people where he's like, I can't trust you with telling you my will 2 steps out in the future, because you're going to jump out and run over there when I need you to go through a specific path. So I'm going to have to tell you 1 step at a time. And there's parts of our lives where he does both of that, right? There's parts of our lives where he's like, I'm going to tell you 1 step at a time. And there's parts where he's like, I'm going to tell you way in advance, because I know that you're not going to run out there. You're going to wait for my leading for you to get to that destination. So I think it's pretty cool, all of this. And again, I'm starting to ramble now, Tim. I don't know. Did that go along with what you were thinking, or is that totally just not at all what you're thinking?
No, it just, what you just said also reaffirms to me the father-children relationship that we should have with God. And you just really described what as fathers and as parents we see with our own children. And it just reconfirms in my mind that relationship is so critical with communing with our Lord.
This is all good stuff, but if I look at these 2 verses, I see something that in the context of it, what he's talking about is that we have a guide, or we have the Spirit that helps us when we are tempted. He's taken on our sins, so we no longer need to sin.
Right.
And it also says here that because he was tempted but did not sin, so we can also. And that's really what I see in these verses, is that he's taken that from us, so we can be tempted, but it's what we do with it. And if we're walking in the Spirit or walking in Jesus Christ, then he will guide us out of that temptation. He says that we will be tested, but he's going to give us a way of escape. And that's what I think these two verses are saying, is that there is sin, and we have sinned, but he died for those. He's already done everything for them, so that when we are tempted, we have a way out. And that's why I look at these two verses.
And I would point out that that's a much better high priest than what the Jews had, right? They didn't have a high priest who necessarily even cared for them and would be necessarily teaching them. We look at the time of Jesus, the high priest didn't really care for the common people, at least from what I see there, as much. He wasn't interested in helping them with their temptations and helping provide a way out. But we have a much better high priest who does that. I like that, Sean. Thank you for bringing that up.
Can you imagine how cynical of a relationship you'd have with your high priest with what you just said, John? I mean, it's just it's kind of mind blowing.
It is.
Yeah, he'd be like, get in line. Since
Exactly,
I gotta cut more. I got bulls. I got stuff to do.
No.
Right.
I got lambs and stuff, pigeons flying all over the place. We're gonna have to take care of that later.
Get a move on. Next. Next.
I like it. Ooh, well, that was fun. I really enjoyed Leviticus. I hope you guys did too. Again, just a great picture of Jesus. We're going to see some other pictures. I'm just excited. I've been jumping ahead, and I saw this one with a city of refuge, and I just love the whole concept of the city of refuge, and the high priest is involved in there. It's going to be a ways. It's like chapter 6, but I'm excited for it. I'm excited about all of these pictures where we get to learn more about who Jesus is and get to remember that both the fact that sin is a serious issue, but on top of that, Jesus made a way. He redeemed us, and it's all incredible. So yes, we are at chapter 3 now. Let's see.